I'm very excited to pick your brain on a couple of topics that I talked a little bit about with a couple of guests recently, but I've heard you approaching it from an angle in some places that I haven't quite heard from other people. So it will be cool to talk about this with you. So the first thing I want to touch on with you is I've been listening to a couple of podcasts with you and some interviews that you've done with other people, and I've repeatedly heard you emphasizing the importance of, monitoring people before you work with them, whether they have any history with eating disorders or just issues with food and just not a very healthy eating behavior. And I guess the question that kept just kind of popping up in my head is, why is eating disorder or just disordered behaviors around eating or just not a healthy relationship with food such an issue in the fitness community in the first place? Do you think it is the fitness industry and kind of the body image issues that develop over time, or the fitness goals that people have and the neurotic focus on them is what's driving these issues? Or do you think that people who are predisposed to having an eating disorder are drawn towards fitness rather? Which one do you think is the case, or what do you think about this?
I think it's both. I'm not going to pretend to be an eating disorder specialist or a sociologist, but I think it also depends on what part of fitness you're focused on, because it's a broad world out there. I mean, there's a huge yoga community, and I would imagine they probably have a lower incidence of eating disorder or disordered eating than we in the kind of supplement driven fitness industry of the bodybuilding world with the fitness expos where, Instagram fitspiration people are flocked to and walk around without shirts on. So I think the portion of the fitness industry that's focused on aesthetics, I think certainly that makes sense that would both draw and create draw a lot of people who have struggled with that previously. And I think it creates that as kind of your acceptance into the tribe and the way you have social acceptability. So I think that drives people to diet, and, dieting in and of itself increases the risk of running into disordered eating. So not that there's never a time and a place to diet. So I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah. And speaking of that, one thing, and I appreciate you acknowledging that you're not an eating disorder specialist. And that's why I'm especially curious on your take on this as a bodybuilding coach, is that I picked up a couple of books recently that were talking about intuitive eating, and they were talking about eating disorders. And what occurred to me is that there were always a couple of good nuggets in these books and a couple of good takeaways. But the reoccurring theme in all of them was that, well, if you want to overcome these issues, then the first thing you have to do is stop dieting. And not only do you have to stop dieting, but you have to get out of this mindset of just basically wanting to lose weight in the first place, or just trying to focus on body image and all of these things. And you, as someone who is working with, these aesthetics people many times, what do you think about this whole thing?
Well, it's for sure. I mean, if when I'm dealing with someone in the midst of contest prep and they're struggling and they're starting to develop unhealthy behaviors, then that's often when I will have a discussion with them about potentially bringing in a specialist alongside to work alongside me. And that's never an easy conversation to have, but I don't think it's a complete surprise to our clients at 3DMJ, because they know we look more holistically in terms of we care about the long-term career of an athlete. We care about their ability to be happy and that the sport is actually enhancing their lives. And if those things aren't going to happen, if we think they're going to burn themselves out or make their life worse, from competition, then we're going to start putting the brakes on as coaches and trying to intervene. So, that's one thing. On the other hand, there's a few ways to look at people who have a background with disordered eating who come into the sport. You could look at that as, it's just another outlet for them to not get healthier. Or you can look at that as a step in the right direction. I mean, there's a big difference between an anorexic person and someone who's a competitive physique athlete. Now they have structure, they have goals. There's periods where if they're doing it correctly, they should be, in a caloric surplus. And again, not that I'm a specialist, but I know a big cornerstone of most eating disorders is gaining a sense of control. And that is hugely common among physique competitors as well. They really enjoy controlling their nutrition, controlling their training, dotting their I's, crossing their T's, tracking variables. On the whole, of course, there's always exceptions. So I think it is sometimes a natural progression to go from, I used to have a clinical eating disorder to I've got that managed, but I'm still actually just very interested in fitness and nutrition. And I think bodybuilding would be a good outlet for that. And I think that doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. I think that can go poorly or that can go well, depending on how honest they are with themselves. If they stay with, I think it's probably a smart idea to have some kind of clinical supervision for someone who has an eating disorder from the past when they compete. Of course, your mileage may vary. And, if it was 15 years ago when you were a teenager and now you're in your 30s, maybe not. But I just think it's important to stay aware and honest and understand that, contest prep and what I would classify as basically semi-starvation can induce disordered eating in people who have no background in it. So imagine what it's like to have a background with eating disorders and then to go through that process. It would just be smart to make sure you cover all your bases and are extra cautious.
Yeah, and so speaking of semi-starvation and contest preps, I've heard you mention a couple of times that when you've had the traditional reverse dieting model, which I hope most of my audience know what I'm talking about here, that you had like a 10% success rate or something, and when you switched to the more assertive recovery diet model, then it jumped up to like 50%. Is that correct?
Yeah, if I had to ballpark it, that would probably be similar numbers. And that's carried on as, 3D Muscle Journey as a whole. It's interesting because from what I understand, some of the treatment methods when you're dealing with someone who has an eating disorder, especially binge eating, is that you create more structure. And that you have ways for them to kind of short circuit that binge eating behavior. So yeah, you need to have some structure, but at the same time, this isn't just classical binge eating out of nowhere that comes post competition. It's very physiologically driven. And if you give someone an unrealistic goal of, right, we're going to barely increase your calories at all post competition, and you don't have that motivating factor of getting on stage, yeah, it just seems to go poorly every single time. And most people end up in this yo-yo fashion where they feel like they're screwing up on the reverse diet and beating themselves up because they just got themselves in a shredded condition and they can't understand why they don't have the same kind of drive anymore. And they'll have these, days of overeating and then days of calorie restriction. And it becomes this semi kind of exercise-induced bulimia almost, if it's not watched carefully. So yeah, we've had a much more success with, instead of keeping someone in a deficit and then a ever decreasing deficit and then a very tiny surplus over months and months and months and months and months, with trying to get them to a reasonable body fat within, say, a month and a half. If in 6 weeks you're 5 to 10% over stage weight, you were in a controlled surplus. So it has the elements of the structure, but it does not keep you dieting. And I think that's, at least is from our experience and what makes sense physiologically and our understanding of psychology, even though we aren't clinicians, that seems to align best with the reality of human nature and biology post-competition.
Yeah. And do you think that, because 50%, that's much, much better than 10%. But obviously, I guess if it was like up to you to decide what the percentage is, it would be 100%. But I guess what I'm thinking about is do you think that it's even or technically possible to reach higher than a certain percentage of success rate? Or do you think that simply getting down to that low in body fat percentage will just inevitably trigger some physiological changes and thereby psychological changes that will just inevitably lead certain percentage of the population to develop just not healthy behaviors around food and just some behaviors that will be problematic, even potentially long term?
It depends. I think a good way to look at it is that when I say 50% of our clients are successful with, a recovery diet, what is the standard for success, right? And then second, does that mean that the next season, those same people who were not successful that time aren't successful the next time? Typically not. People do much better with subsequent competition seasons in bodybuilding, and they get better and better at transitioning back to, normalcy, really. And I would say if the standard is not being depressed and still having some understandable post prep blues, but not being disturbed and emotionally stressed from not being able to have some kind of modicum of control over your eating. And then simply not overshooting where you started and having to start your off season in a position where you have to diet just to get to a normal off season body fat. If that's the standard for success, then I would say most people within 1 to 3 seasons figure it out. And so it depends on how you look at it. If you were just to do a cross section of everybody, sure, it might only be 50%. But if it's something that is looked at as a learning process, that's pretty good. I would say if we were to break that down into second season, third season, fourth season, that percentage would keep climbing. Because you're right, it's very difficult. You're going to be really, really hungry. And even if I told you to put, a 600 calorie surplus, after having the weekend to eat whatever you wanted on Monday, it's common. Like I said, like 50% of people that some point during that week that might end up into being a 1500 calorie surplus because they just have one of those days, and that can be stressful because they're like, oh man, I'm 900 calories over what I was supposed to eat. And, as coaches, we just go, don't worry about it. Just get back on the 600 calorie surplus tomorrow. And if we get there a little earlier, no big deal. But yeah, so I mean, it all depends on, I guess, what you think the target is or the aim is. And I think the big thing is you need to shift your mindset away from, if I mess up, quote unquote, a day of my recovery diet or reverse diet, that's bad. And more so, man, if I was already in a surplus and I binged, maybe I needed that, so long as it isn't a cyclical, or not cyclical, but an often occurring thing that is really stressing you out, like, multiple times in a month, 4, 5, 6 times, something like that, where you feel out of control and you're binging, then, every 2-3 weeks, if you're having one time where you have a day where you eat more than you're intended to in your 6-week kind of recovery process, that's normal. That's not a big deal.
Yeah. And that's interesting that you bring that up because, I've heard, I forgot who it was, but just someone in like in the natural bodybuilding community, I believe, who said that at some point, the only way to get people out of this dieting, very restricted or just kind of disordered behavior type of mindset is to just let them eat whatever they want, whenever they want for a while until they get that out of their system. And I remember when I first heard that, I was like, that might work for some people, but some people might not stop until they get like obese. But do you think, I remember when I first interviewed you, that that you said that when after your first bodybuilding season, you had these reoccurring binge episodes and then you were trying to make up for them with these low calorie days. And do you think that if you didn't try to make up for these days and you just kind of accepted the binge and then just kept eating in a surplus, then you would have been back to normal earlier on and you wouldn't have put on all that extra weight?
Probably, yeah. So just to kind of respond to that first comment, I do think there needs to be some modicum of structure, and just letting people eat whatever they want. The tough thing is that they might be eating, but it's not necessarily what they want. It's not like it's every competitor after the show is going, oh, I can't wait to eat, and then some coach comes around and goes, no. You need to control this a little bit. Need to do a recovery diet or reverse diet. There's an incredible amount of push and pull within a lot of these competitors where they have a drive to eat and they are eating, but they don't want to be gaining weight that fast. And sometimes they have a realistic idea of how much weight they should be gaining and what kind of surplus they have. Sometimes they have an unrealistic one. I would say that the typical kind of reverse diet where it's, I took 6 months to put on 8 pounds is probably unrealistic, and they shouldn't even be trying to do that in the first place. But in my case, like 2007, I put on 50 pounds in 2 months, and that's not healthy. That's really not something that should happen. And I would like to think, looking back, that if I had, I think my issue was on the other end of the spectrum. It wasn't that I was trying to reverse diet and I was just, like screwing myself up. That term didn't really exist yet. I had no plan leaving the season. And I was fine with it for a while. I think when I got up to 12 pounds over stage weight, I just looked good. I lost like quad cuts or something, and I didn't have a hamstring separation, but I just looked full. I looked big. I was stronger. And I liked eating, so it wasn't a big deal. But it didn't go away. I just stayed cyclically binging. And then when I tried to address it, that's when I had problems. So I think perhaps if I had been given some type of structure, but structure that put me in a modest surplus, like if I had been told, hey, just eat, 3,500 to 4,000 calories a day, that's a lot of food. But I was eating, if you think about it, what kind of calorie level was I eating to gain 50 pounds in 2 months? It was more than that. So, but the problem was, I think it was some of my response to those days. Like once I'd gotten to a place where I wasn't necessarily comfortable with gaining any additional fat, and I'd have one of these, 5,000, 6,000 calorie days, that's when I'd go, oh my God, I got to fix that. And the next day would be, protein, vegetables, and not much, like less than 2,000 calories. And then it would happen again. So I think I just needed some guidance there and some structure, really.
Yeah. And just for me to, or for the listeners to imagine it, like once you've started to gain like uncontrollable amounts of weight, like, when you went from like 40 pounds to like 50 pounds during that period, how was that like? Was it like binge eating like 5,000 or 6,000 calories like multiple times a week, or how did that look like?
Well, it's funny, basically I think for the first maybe 3 or 4 weeks, it was just like, whatever, I'm just going to eat because I've been dieting for so long. And then I think I got into the 190s, as I said. I was on stage at like 178. I got into the 190s and I was like, that's pretty rapid. I should try to slow things down. And I would have it was almost every other day, really, of a day where I was having 4 or 5 meals, eating till complete fullness, and being very, very stressed out by that. And then there was a period right around where I was like 210, 215. And I was just like, whatever, I'm just not going to modify my behavior. I'm going to eat when I'm hungry and I'll stop when I don't, and when I'm not. And I got up to 226 and I finally was like, all right, I'm ready to diet. I don't really want to eat anymore. I'm not that hungry. So for me, I was a 16-pound overshoot from where I started my contest prep before I actually was in a position where I had some kind of modicum of control to diet. And then I had to spend on and off periods for the next year, dieting back down to start my next contest season at something like, I want to say 200 pounds. So so it was it's possible that if I had had that attitude of whatever, just eat and don't try to modify it, that I would have ended at a lower body weight. But I don't know. It's tough to say. Hindsight's
I guess
2020, and it's 10 years ago now, so I'm not really sure.
Yeah, hindsight 220 in this case. Okay, that was bad.
Exactly.
but I guess the silver lining is that at least you did get that attitude at some point when you stopped. Like, I guess when you had that attitude that like, okay, whatever, I'm just going to eat until I'm not hungry. If at that point you still had the attitude okay, I'm still going to like have low calorie days or whatever, then maybe you would have overshot even more. So I guess it's still better than could have been.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I realized that was not working, so and then it was probably making it worse. I figured that out at some point. I mean, I wouldn't go back and change the experience, because it's what led me to want to start 3D Muscle Journey with the guys and now Andrea, because I started to realize that there's potential harm in the sport, and in my experience, a lot of potential benefits, of teaching yourself what you can accomplish, and a lot of potential joy and life enhancement to be taken from bodybuilding. So I wanted to try to help people deal with the negatives and focus on the positives, and find a way to make it an overall net, benefit to life. So yeah, it was an educational experience, if you will.
Yeah. You definitely made you a better coach today. So I guess it's a net benefit for a lot of people, including you. But next thing I want to touch on with you is intuitive eating, as a lot of people like to call it. And I guess I'm not really a big fan of the term, and I think neither you are, because it really implies that you are literally listening to some intuitions to dictate what you're eating. So maybe we could call it autoregulatory eating, or hunger and satiety based eating. But you touched on this in the latest mass edition, that this is something you like to use with your clients, and you advise people to try out once they are in the off season, they're off of, contest prep. So when we look at intuitive eating, if you had to kind of compare it to macro tracking, or maybe put together like a pros and cons list of what are the benefits of intuitive eating and what are the downsides, how would you say it compares to macro tracking, for example?
Well, I probably wouldn't frame the discussion that way, because I think intuitive eating doesn't really have a well-defined criteria. The video I use in mass, and what I normally talk about, it is flexible dieting. And a lot of discussion around flexible dieting is confused because people have started to use if you fit your macros and flexible dieting as synonyms or the same thing, and they're not. The root of flexible dieting came from research by a group led by Westenhofer, where they actually identified that there's two different types of restraint in people who are attempting to diet. There's flexible and there's rigid restraint. And people with rigid restraint tended to see food as black and white, and seeing it being on or off the diet in a dichotomous way. So they would run into more issues with kind of this binge eating restriction. And in general, they were heavier in body weight, unsatisfied with their body, stressed out, basically unsuccessful and stressed out because of it, and had more hangups around food in their body than people who had a flexible restraint model, where they were able to look at the day and the weeks more fluidly, so that they could say, all right, well, if I had a little more today, I'll eat less tomorrow. And they were probably more in tune with their hunger signals. So I like that verbiage better, because intuitive eating, to me, like you said, it has some of those weaknesses of interpretation. Like, it's really easy to go, right, so just eat when you want to. Okay, we have an obesity epidemic that's been getting worse over years. That doesn't appear to be working. And then another critique is that within the fitness community, a lot of the people who promote intuitive eating were neurotic food trackers for years before they started promoting intuitive eating. So they learned to incorporate some type of balance between quantifying food and their hedonic drive to eat. And I think that's basically the model that I think makes sense for physique athletes, is to have flexible structure. So, physique athletes typically thrive with structure, and how rigid that structure is basically needs to be scaled to the goal. So, I think just simply if it fits your macros is a potentially harmful oversimplification of a model of flexible dieting, because it depends on what level of accuracy you have. Like when I hear someone go, "Yeah, I added 3 grams of fat," or I had a 7-gram bump to my carbs this week, or they write down their macros and it's like 62 fat, 367 carbs, and 221 protein because they got it from some calculator. I'm thinking, well, like, why isn't that rounded to the nearest 5 or 10? Like, do they think they can be that accurate? Do they think there's value in being that accurate? And what, with someone like that, what do they think when they go over by a gram? Have they blown it? And I've seen just as many people treat macros as dichotomous as I have seen people treat, rigid meal plans, to where if they go over 5 grams on their carbs, that they turns into a binge, which is defeating the whole purpose. So I think tracking your macronutrients is a step in the right direction. It's certainly less rigid than I have to have, broccoli, steak, and an apple at 6 p.m. And if the timing's wrong or the food type is wrong, like even if I have the macros the same at 6:30 p.m., I think that is certainly more rigid. At least you have different ability to swap in other foods when you're doing it to fit your macros. But really, it's the issue is the mindset and the way you see the diet. and having some type of, but then the problem becomes, okay, well, how do I just make myself have flexible restraint? And you can't. But there is evidence showing that adopting behaviors that are classified as more flexible tend to correlate strongly with weight loss, maintenance, and success long-term over 1 and 3 years. Is a cool study that showed that. So basically you go, okay, well, what's the model that I need to teach people flexible behaviors? How would I do that? And that's essentially what those videos are in our mass research review. I talk about what models I use to teach bodybuilders to be more flexible, and how I have a refeed day that could change days based on the situation, or implementing diet breaks, or things like 20% borrowing, where you just simply have a cap on the number of calories you can take from one day to get to the next, so it doesn't turn into this, binge and restrict cycle. Or different tiers of tracking. So where if you do miss your macros substantially because of an error, or just simply, a little bit of a break in willpower, then you can then revert to calories and go, right, well, I totally blew my carbs. Well, that's okay. That just means I'm going to eat less fat for the day, and just focus on calories and protein. Or that it allows more flexibility. If you're focusing on calories and protein, you can work in small amounts of alcohol, depending on your goal, and within reason, like say 15% of total calories. So all of those ways are basically rules and guidelines that provide the structure to engage in more flexible restraint behavior versus having a rigid restraint model, or knowing that you're supposed to be flexible, but having no idea how to actually do that.
Right. So if we were to talk about something where, like intuitive eating, would that be, I think you mentioned that with some of your athletes and with yourself, you are weighing in every day and you're not actively tracking your macros in the off season, for example. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So what that actually looks like is when I start to have the conversation, because fair enough, when someone is trying to get on stage at basically minimal subcutaneous fat levels, or whatever the equivalent is for their division, they're going to have a long, hard diet, and they're going to need to be relatively meticulous with their tracking. And normally I'm asking them to be within, 5 to 10 grams of their macros. And some of those strategies that I mentioned earlier, we can have roving refeeds, we'll take diet breaks, and we can potentially do 20% borrowing and going down the tiers. But in the end, most of the time is going to be spent within, 5 grams of our macros, and preparing your own meals, and, being the guy who might just have a Diet Coke out with his friends, and is just that person at the end of their diet is going to be pretty restricted. Maybe not as much as compared to traditionally, but nonetheless, the time to really try to ease off on the level of rigidity and accuracy is during the off season, where you're not going to be judged by 7 people as to the lines in your butt. So what that looks like is that after we have that recovery diet period, where I'm increasing them into a pretty substantial surplus and cutting their cardio like in half, almost right out the gates, after having a celebratory untracked day on Saturday and Sunday, if their show was on Saturday. That recovery diet period, now we're going to be focusing more on calories and protein, or it really depends on the athlete. If they are too nervous to go to calories and protein, I'll just give them broader targets for the macros, plus or minus 20 grams now, so long as they're within, say, 150, 100 calories of their target. And then once we've put on a certain amount of weight and we've gotten to an athletic off-season body composition, say after 4 to 6 weeks, that's when we start basically removing as many elements of tracking as we can while still being optimal in our approach. So what that means is, you've just dieted for 6 to 8 months and we've had a 1 month recovery period. You've established some awesome habits. You can probably look at a sweet potato and tell me how much it weighs within 5 to 10 grams. You can look at a chicken breast and you can have a pretty good idea of how many grams of protein are in it. So let's put those habits to use. You've been eating within a rough kind of percentage breakdown of carbs, fat, and protein this whole time. It's unlikely that all of a sudden you will forget to eat protein when you've been consuming, 2.5 grams per kg for a year, So how about we just weigh in, right? Just, at least 3 days per week. But, if it doesn't stress you out, we'll get a daily weigh-in so we can get a nice average. And we can just use your change in body weight as a gauge of energy balance. And then we can just tell you to eat a little closer to being full or a little further from being full, and do some kind of autoregulatory habit-based tracking to get the rate of weight gain we want. And then every once in a while we can audit it just to make sure your protein's in the right spot and that you're not really low on carbs or really low on fat. And that's normally rare. I mean, if someone's been following a relatively balanced contest prep approach, and if you let them kind of eat in a manner that is still like, our goal is to hit similar targets, but don't have to track it, because, you are eating macros, whether or not you're actually tracking your macros, believe it or not. And then we just find out what is the minimal number of nutritional variables we can track while still hitting our goals. And I'll give you my personal example is that I tend to, believe it or not, as a protein researcher, if I don't track it, my protein will end up low, say below even like 1.8 grams per kg. And I tend to forget to eat fruit and vegetables. So what I do is I actively keep in track in my head that I want to have at least 2 servings of fruit and vegetables every day, and that I keep a running count in my head of protein. And when I coach somebody, the only difference is that I ask them to put that on a spreadsheet so that they'll track the 1 to 3 variables in addition to body weight that they may need to make sure they're doing everything optimally as an athlete.
Right. So, if you are working with a guy who, is at a healthy body fat level, had been tracking for a while, had been adherent to macro tracking. So basically it's a structured person, and you trust that the client is ready to move into maybe just hunger and satiety based nutrition and just using the scale weight to gauge energy balance. How do you start that person on that basically? Do you have, for example, like some sort of like, not a list of foods, but just like some suggestion in terms of food choices? Because food choices are more important when you are not tracking your macros, because you are more susceptible to overeating because you're not tracking things. Or do you just kind of trust that they will use their athletic common sense with these kinds of things?
Well, I think it starts, if they come to me just out of the blue and I'm working with them and then I have to make, or I want to institute that change, this wouldn't be the case. But ideally, it starts before that. And it is talking to the person before you're going to make the change about, hey, I'm thinking about at some point in the future when you're ready, maybe having you track less variables. So think about your eating behaviors, and why you're doing the things you do and what our goals are, and start to pay more attention to your hunger and satiety. Because it's often, in my opinion, not actually true that all people are more likely to overeat when they are eating based on hunger once they've established good behaviors versus by the numbers. Because when you eat by the numbers, you're teaching yourself to not listen to hunger and you're not listening to satiety, which can have consequences,
Totally.
Yeah. So basically the first step is I do it if they want to, because if everything's going great and they're not stressed and life's good and they're still having an active social life and they can, not weigh things and go to a restaurant with their wife on the weekends and there's no issues. Hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? If they're happy. But if they are interested in the idea of just having to manage less variables and have a little more freedom in their life and, not pop on, MyFitnessPal on their phone when they're at the restaurant real quick, then fine, great. Let's do that. And then we do it in a tapered fashion. I wouldn't just take someone from, meticulously tracking all 3 macros and weighing all their foods to just track body weight. I would probably say, hey, let's move to calories and protein and just get within 100 calories and see how you do. And we'd do that for a few weeks until they felt comfortable, and then we would move forward. So I think with everything, you want to do it at the pace that the person is comfortable with, because there's no real urgency to it. I tracked my macros for 5 years, and it wasn't really an issue. I mean, I was doing a lot of things not intentionally that I would have someone do now. Like I wouldn't weigh or worry about it too much, and I would shift to just calories if I went out to eat. But I was limiting myself. Okay, I'm only going to eat out twice per week. Now I eat out as many times as I want because I don't actually think that my macros are on a pedestal. I realize that if I eat to my hunger levels and if I modulate it that way, at least when I'm in a surplus, obviously if I dieted, that wouldn't be something I'd want to do, or I wouldn't be able to diet. But I can gain weight at an appropriate rate or maintain it pretty much at will. And while just, paying a little attention to vegetables, protein and fruit. So.
Yeah. And do you think that now that you are an advanced level lifter and you are eating based on your hunger and satiety signals, do you think that some days, for example, you go out to a restaurant and you eat a lot more because of whatever reason, and then you are just eating based on your hunger and satiety signals, that will result in you eating a lot less the next day, and it just kind of autoregulates itself over time. And those deficit days, even in the off season when you want to gain, are not an issue long term because it just all kind of balances out.
Oh yeah, totally. I definitely think that's the case. And interestingly enough, there's a fair amount of research out there that it's not. It sounds weird, but I mean, a sustained calorie deficit will typically result in some lean body mass losses. But when you look at what relationships there are between, muscle mass gain when someone's not intentionally dieting, it's not as much related to the size of the surplus as it is making sure you get adequate protein in and have a good stimulus. Like if you look at a lot of the studies that are coming out with from Jose Antonio, where these guys are eating a ton of protein or less protein, and one group's gaining more weight, but they're gaining similar amounts of muscle mass. You have to assume that the group eating a ton of protein is just more satiated, and they're in kind of an intermittent surplus and small deficit, and it doesn't seem to be impacting their long-term gains. I mean, there's even a study that's, I think, a year long. And then there's the study by Garth, I want to say 2011, where the group that was in like a 600 calorie surplus more than the other group that was, kind of in a self-modulated small surplus. They both gained weight, but they gained a similar amount of lean body mass, kind of just intuitively trying to gain weight. So yeah, I don't worry about it too much. And it also, another thing with intuitive eating is you kind of have to eat like an adult to some degree. I mean, the quote unquote intuitive eating that I've gotten to now did come with 5 years of tracking my macros. So that means I might have a night out. I might have nachos and a margarita, but I'm still pretty good at keeping my overall day from being like, I'm not going to have more than like 1,000 calorie surplus any given day, and then that might mean the next 5 days, not that I'm tracking it, are going to be in a, 100, 200 calorie deficit or something like that, which is, pretty minor when you think about it. So that's a lot different than restricting myself to just protein shakes the next day, and tracking that,
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm just curious, like I'm just going to throw a couple of like hypothetical real life situations at you too, because I'm curious how you implement this with yourself or with clients. So if let's say you have a client who, you started this intuitive approach with, and you agreed that you're going to monitor the scale weight, that will be your gauge. And you just see that, scale weight is going up way too rapidly and the client is starting to gain weight just way too quickly. What do you advise them to do in that kind of situation? Do you advise them to be less full at each meal or modify their food selection a little bit? What would be your go-to strategy here?
Yeah, I'd probably start with some habit-based stuff. Like, hey, let's focus on eating each meal until you are satisfied and not full. Don't chew as quickly, or like chew slower. Take your time with the meal. Drink a glass of water beforehand, and then so a few behavioral things like that, like eat at regular meal times. Order slightly less high calorie items when you're at restaurants. That's where it tastes the best and it's easy to overeat. And then if that doesn't solve the issue, then we just take a step back. Okay, let's start tracking protein. And let's just take a step back from there. And if this is still an issue, then we go, okay, let's go back to macros and just have broad ranges. So yeah, it's going to look different from everyone. The goal isn't to get necessarily everyone to just tracking body weight. The goal is to get them to tracking as minimal number of variables as they can while still reaching their goals and being happy. So that where that ends up is going to look a little different for everybody.
Yeah. No, that totally clears it up. And then if someone, I think you mentioned that you tend to accidentally undereat when you do this. If someone is, not progressing in the gym as they want to, or, they just apparently always undereat, then would you, again, target it from a behavioral standpoint? or would you advise maybe just tracking for a while to make sure that they're eating, for example, enough fat or enough protein or something?
Yeah, same process. I'd start with asking them to eat more calorie dense foods and to sneak things in. Like drinking juice is a great way to sneak calories in. Do some liquid calories, there's a lot of little tricks you can't. It's easy to overeat. Our entire food industry is built around helping us do that. So eat out more, eat more calories that taste good. Try to enjoy your food more. Eat to your cravings. All the things you would tell someone not to do who is struggling with weight gain, you would tell them to do. Try to eat on the lower end of the protein intake if you're kind of have a rough gauge of where you are in your head. Because let's be honest, you've been tracking macros for years. You kind of know where you're settling at the end of the day. If that doesn't result in an appropriate rate of weight gain, then let's start tracking calories and protein. You just step back as needed to get to the goal.
Yeah, totally. So, when before I interviewed you, or before we got to this call, I asked a couple of people in a few communities if they had some questions to you, and we had a couple of good questions, but basically I could categorize them into two big categories, and one of them was related to body fat percentages. And a lot of questions regarding can you stay at 8 to 10% body fat? What's a good body fat percentage? All those kinds of things. And I guess a more general question that could be helpful for a lot of people here is, when you have a client or you are trying to determine this for yourself, how would you determine if it would be beneficial for you to try to get a bit heavier, maybe carry a bit more body fat in the off season, or whether you're an Alberto and it's appropriate for you to stay, single digit body fat in the off season? How would you determine that?
Well, the cool thing is that your brain is heavily linked in body weight regulation. If you the biggest sensor for leptin in the brain, so I go completely behaviorally, if you are still food focused, you're too lean. It's honestly, it's that simple. Assuming everything else has kind of been sorted, it's not just immediately after competition where you're going to potentially be food focused for an extended period, maybe 3 to 4 months before you feel normal, almost regardless of your rate of weight gain, almost regardless. But most of the time it's not, a lot of people go, oh, I've heard it's between 8 to 12%. I'm going to try 8. And they may be someone who's kind of behavioral settling point and where they're not food focused to 16%. And they're going to be struggling for a long time until they accept that. So I think it's simply a matter of basically seeing at what point are you not food focused? What point can you not worry about it? Where whatever behaviors you've gotten from your time in fitness are enough to sustain your weight and you're not constantly thinking about eating. Because if you are, that's an issue. It shouldn't be ignored or just seen as just a character trait. I've talked to some people who are like, nah, man, I'm always hungry. That's just the way I am. And I go, well, maybe that's possible. I'm not going to completely discount that, but a lot of times it's because of people don't know what's the chicken and what's the egg. They feel like they have to constantly restrict themselves because they're always food focused, and if they don't, they'll get obese. But maybe it's actually constantly restricting themselves that is the reason they're always food focused, and they've never really given themselves a chance to just walk around a little bit heavier. It's unlikely that you're just that person who will just eat into oblivion, even though you regularly train, have a good idea of calories, have a high protein intake, eat healthy, etc. The people are out there who will need that, but it's certainly not normal.
Yeah, and one thing, if I may drop here, and it's merely an observation, and I guess I just want to drop it here because I find it very interesting, is that I find that it's funny, like your generation of bodybuilders, you're only slightly older than I am, but you, Alberto, Lane, and then, guys before you like Jeff Alberts, what I see is that you've all had these periods earlier on when you just had these long off season where you were kind of heavier, maybe admittedly heavier than you should have been. And you were carrying more fat than probably was needed, but you just didn't care about it that much. And that's when you made some of your best gains. And like my generation, even though I'm only slightly younger than you are, but we grew up on the social media, intermittent fasting, stay shredded all year long. And we are the ones who end up spinning our wheels for years on end and not making any real progress. So I don't know. Does that resonate with you, what I'm just saying?
I think yes, to a certain degree. I think people who are, like the stereotypical thing back when I was early coming up, we're talking when I first started lifting weights in 2004, was that there's the guys who go on the dreamer bulk and get too fat, think it's all muscle. And then there's the guys who never make any gains because they always want to have abs. I think it wasn't as socially acceptable to be in the latter camp before, when like in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, there wasn't like a strong outlet for that. And then I remember when Martin Birkin and Lean Gainz and other guys who kind of had these popularized approaches to, maintaining a low body fat percentage with less effort. Like once they got credibility, and this isn't a knock against them, I think they've done some good work. It's just often taken too far by the followers rather than the actual person. I think once that became socially acceptable and there's an outlet, instead of all these, big roided out bodybuilders telling you, quit being a pussy, just, eat more food, don't have abs. That was basically, that was like basically half of the T Nation articles and Elite FTS articles that I grew up on, were, I remember an article on T Nation from Dave Tate saying, having trouble gaining weight, we'll get a large pizza and dump olive oil all over it and just eat it all. So which is insane, when you think about it. But if anything, there was this culture in the mainstream online bodybuilding community of, if you're not gaining weight, you're not making gains. And if you can't gain weight, suck it up and eat more food, which was the prevailing thought. And I will say that now with some of the leadership and quote unquote fitspiration and the constant eye of social media always following you and everyone posting, filtered pictures of them in their best lighting and posed shots, that there is now a huge culture around always being aesthetic, and I think the downside to that is that it asks a lot of people to try to do that who don't have the experience or the foundation or the genetics or psychology to do that. And I think there's more wheel spinning from that. However, I mean, like Alberto and myself, Alberto got up to 250 pounds and he competes at 165. So he's had to spend a couple years cutting to get back down to, a reasonable body fat percentage. So there's certainly extremists on either end. Neither one's good. But certainly I think the one thing you can be sure of is that if you're eating everything in sight, you're probably not holding back, your lean body mass gains. It may become a big pain in the ass if you ever want to actually diet down and get on stage and you have to lose half your body weight. But, that's it just depends on which kind of problem you want to have. Yeah.
I mean, it's, I guess everybody has their own biases. It's just me, looking back at, my past couple of years, if I could advise my past self, I would have probably said that dirty bulking is not good, but it probably is still better than just being obsessed all the time on being super lean. Because dirty bulking, at least as you said, you're not holding back on the
I would agree. And you're less likely to develop some not so healthy relationships with food in your body. You might be just not happy the way you look in the mirror. And have to diet at some point, but I would agree if that's the lesser of two evils,
Yeah, exactly. And just to give people some perspective, from all the bodybuilders that you're working with, what would be, some of the higher body fat percentages that guys maintain in the off season and are still productive, and you consider that as fine.
And the funny thing is, body fat percentage, if you measure it on DEXA, on average, it tends to be higher than other methods, and that can freak people out. But if what we, the internet consensus of what different body fat percentages are based on visual assessment, I'll use that standard that we all kind of have an idea of, where an ab cage is probably 15% and, full-blown abs is 10%, that kind of thing. This is for guys, of course. For women, you kind of have to add basically, another 5% to whatever I say. I've seen a fair amount of my clients at different times be in the range of 16 to 20%, and that'd be not an issue. you know.
Mm-hmm.
It does mean that we might have to do a mini cut sometime, like, oh, you want to diet for a show in 6 months? All right, let's do 1 month mini cut now. We'll go 3 months, do another 1 month mini cut, get you down to like, say, 15%, and then, you know, bring food back up and then start our diet 6 months out. And that's not a big deal, you know. It just means you have to plan a little bit. But yeah, it's not like I keep all my guys at 8 to 12% and all my gals at, you know, 16 to 20% body fat all year round, or when they're not competing. It's much more based on what they're comfortable with and when they're not food focused, and wherever that is. And for some people, that is on the higher end of what we would consider a healthy body fat percentage. It's still normal.
Yeah, and I mean, just to give people some perspective on this, like I just had this discussion with someone not that long ago that like it used to be the traditional like stay somewhere between like 10 to 15% in the off season, and with the rise of social media, this kind of changed over time to like 8 to 10. And if you're over 10, then you're kind of getting
fat. No, I totally agree. And yeah, people have these warped ideas of what body fat percentages mean or look like. Yeah, I never have people, my clients, if they want to go get a DEXA or get dunked or get pinched, that's fine. But I never ask them to do that because it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is where they're comfortable with what they look like. Whether that's a realistic, healthy body image to have, because sometimes, often more often than not, what they desire is not a realistic goal to maintain. And then, you know, so a lot of the work is on being able to accept that walking around at 15% is fine, and then just focusing on, okay, so are you constantly thinking about food? Are you struggling to hit your macros or not go over them? You know, if we didn't have some system of tracking, would you gain 10 pounds? Well, it's too lean. And, you know, and there's a level of denial that comes with that, but you can only be in denial that so long. I mean, I can't tell you how many competitors I've seen for like 3-4 years would just try to maintain too lean and eventually just go, it's not fucking worth it. I don't care. You know, and they just let themselves get a little heavier in the off season. And I think that's a good thing. That's what should happen. Ideally it won't take that long, but it's hard to get over that when you've got all the pressure or the perceived pressure to maintain leaner than you should be.
Yeah, I guess the 18% body fat that you can maintain is better than the 12% body fat that you can't, to put it very, very pedantically. But so, like one thing that I want to ask you, and I decided actually not to ask this because I wanted to keep it at a consistent theme. But since we're on the topic, you mentioned mini cuts, and one thing that I was thinking about a lot is like usually the recommended ratios of gaining to cutting for bodybuilders is like a 4-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 ratio. And so what do you think if someone was to do this in like a shorter term period of like 3 to 4 weeks of gaining and like 1 or 2 weeks of cutting and like repeating that? Do you think that would work, or what would you think?
I prefer not to have someone dieting that frequently. I'm sure it could work, but I smile because I think it's interesting that 4-to-1 ratio is still out there, because I'm pretty sure, and I don't want to just take credit for something that I may have just repeated, that I started saying that on like the bodybuilding.com forums in like 2008 or something like that. And it's become, I love how that's become standard practice. It's a little minor piece of pride, but yeah, the reason why I decided to make some ratio is that I just saw too many people going, oh, I'm doing another mini cut. And I'm like, is it really a mini cut if you spent 6 months out of the year, quote unquote, mini cutting? Like, that's just taking a break from a year-long diet every other month. You know, come on, dude. So yeah, I tried to just get it across to people like, sure, you don't want to start your next contest prep diet 40 pounds over. So you need to have some method of mitigating fat gain, but you are a bodybuilder. So that means you probably want to be in a surplus the majority of the time. So how about 80%? You know, 4-to-1 sounds good. And that can be manipulated. Someone can literally do 1 month on and 1 week diet if they want, or they could do 4 months, 1 month, you know? So I don't use the term mini cut too much, because sometimes I'll have someone in a gaining phase for 8 months and they'll diet for 2 months. I think 2 months is probably longer than I would call something a mini cut, but it would be appropriate in the case for how long I had them in a surplus, you know?
Oh man, anytime I'm talking to someone like you about these topics, it always hits me that like it just doesn't have to be so freaking complicated like a lot of people make it out to be. I don't know. It's just interesting. But like, yeah. And my last question that I want to ask you, and this was came from another couple of people, like similar themed questions, but it was about maintenance phases. And there were a couple of questions on like how to prevent binges if someone is moving from like a very strict or ambitious goal that they had, and now they achieve the goal and they want to move to a maintenance phase. And I guess I just find this question interesting because in that second mess edition that I saw, you touched on this, that bodybuilders typically don't have issues cutting or bulking. They have more issues with maintaining. So first of all, do you even think that maintenance phases are really necessary for bodybuilding, or should it always be some sort of, goal-oriented behavior? And why do you think that maintenance is just so freaking hard for people?
Well, there's a couple questions there. I'll start with, do I think bodybuilders should have maintenance phases? Probably not philosophically, but what a gaining phase will look like for an advanced bodybuilder might as well be maintenance, because of the rate of weight gain that you can use I might have someone gain a pound a month as an advanced bodybuilder, but I'm fully expecting 80% of that to be body fat, at a high level. So that means, they're going to gain, 3-4 pounds of muscle in a year, but, 12 pounds of body weight. So that means that, we're going to have to periodically diet every once in a while. And, you could slow that down even more and just gain half a pound a month, but then that basically looks like maintenance, doesn't it? So, So I think that's my answer for bodybuilders. And I think the reason why bodybuilders don't do well with that is because they're so goal oriented in general, and they brought up in a culture of cut or bulk. And also with enough time in the sport where you are teaching yourself to either overeat or undereat, just living life and eating normally and sustaining a rough calorie maintenance is harder to do. That's not to say you can't make gains at maintenance. I think there is that misconception that you have to be in a calorie surplus to put on muscle mass, but you will recomp, quote unquote, from being at maintenance at a slower pace. And then eventually you'll get hungry and put yourself into a surplus if you're intuitively eating, as your body fat over the course of a year goes from 12% to 10%. And then all of a sudden you find yourself hungry again, and then you'll get back up to 12%, but at a heavier weight. That's something you'll hear a lot of advanced natural bodybuilders talk about. They'll because they're not looking to gain a pound a week. They'll say something like, "Man, this is the best I've made 180 pounds look." And they're thinking back to 2012 or something like that. And that is essentially, for what it looks like, it might as well be maintenance, but it is still someone trying to make progress and eating for recovery, and not worrying about if they're in a small surplus on some days, and letting it just slowly accumulate over time. So I think that's what maintenance looks like for a bodybuilder. And that is difficult because for the first couple of years, you're brought up bulking and cutting. And, it is the mark of an advanced bodybuilder if they're someone who's able to have a more normal relationship with food, because it means they found normalcy within the sport, for sure.
Yeah. And then on the on the question of why is behaviorally maintenance so hard for bodybuilders, do you think it is because of that, because they've been brought up on the bulking and cutting mentality?
I think that's part of it. I also think that it's a lack of structure, or at least it feels like it. Like if you don't have a target rate of weight gain or weight loss, then how do you quantify if you're doing it right? So I think that's, and you can get around that. You can set a target rate of weight gain for like a month or 2 months. It's rare that you actually have someone who does not want to gain any weight at all. I think that's actually much more common in general fitness, where you might have someone who's obese who gets to healthy weight and they go, right, now we need to institute behaviors to prevent you from getting obese again. But for a bodybuilder, even when they're at a point where they are so close to their genetic ceiling that any weight gain they have is going to be like 99% fat, that's not the mentality they're going to have. They wouldn't have got to their genetic ceiling if they had that mentality. They're always seeking to push themselves a little harder and a little further. So I know like 45-year-old bodybuilders who are they're not going to be in maintenance. I'm not going to be in maintenance, like I'm not here to maintain, I'm here to improve, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's antithetical to the spirit of bodybuilding. So I think that also causes them problems.
Yeah, yeah. And if I may just add one thing, I guess that's why a lot of bodybuilders take up powerlifting. And I just talked about this with Andrea Valdez not that long ago, that like even if you don't powerlift, when you are done cutting or like a weight loss period, just think about taking up a hobby that you had some time ago. Maybe it's, playing music with a band or something. Just, you have to kind of get your mind off of just focusing just on your physique, because the progress you will make is just too slow to be hyper focused on it all the time.
Yeah. And that's why powerlifting is such a natural fit for many bodybuilders, is because it gives them an objective measurement of something to improve on and focus on that meets that drive. And you can, at least with powerlifting, it's not like playing in a band. You can convince yourself that me getting stronger is potentially meaning that I'm making some muscular adaptations. So, not that I'm discouraging people from bands, but I'm just kind of explaining why so many bodybuilders end up doing powerlifting in the off season, is because it does fill that void, and it fills it in probably a pretty useful way in most cases, unless they, really take it too far and just, hurt themselves or something like that. But anyway, it is very much about finding a way to manage the reality that as you advance, the rate of weight gain is going to be slower, and being okay with that. I think that was a tough one. I think that's a tough one for most people. That's what kind of leads a lot of intermediates to program hopping. It's because they're looking for something that will provide them the same rate of gain that initial program they were on gave them. And that's why it leads a lot of them to finding that every time they try to gain weight, they just get fat, because they're looking for some diet approach or some combination of macros or the perfect quote unquote diet for them that will yield the same rate of muscle gain that they had as a novice. And that it is a little bit of a grieving process to just accept that that's over with. That's not going to happen. You gain the first 80% of your muscle mass in the first 1 to 2 years of training, and you're going to spend the next 20, 30 years gaining that last 20%. And exactly. That's definitely, it's a shift in mindset.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, Eric, I asked you all my questions. So thank you so much for doing this, and really lots of cool knowledge as usual. So my last question is there any resources, just places you want people to check out and want me to direct them to?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, on the topic of flexible dieting and all this stuff, we have a lot of useful video and written blog perspectives on this at 3dmusclejourney.com. Which also links to our YouTube channel. And then I've written a fair amount about behavior and lifestyle in the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, which you can check out at muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. And the first issue of Mass, which is free, which you can get at stronger-by-science.com/mass, has the part 1 video series that you referenced, where I talk about flexible dieting. And then in our first subscriber issue, I do part 2. So if you're interested in any of those resources, if you want to nerd it out with Mass, or you just want to read more kind of general articles, check out 3dmusclejourney.com.
Awesome. Cool. Issue. That was the word I was looking for. I was at edition, and it sounded really silly as I was saying it, but issue. So, all right. Awesome. Thank you so much. And it was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me on. It's an honor.
All right, guys, Abel here again. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe on YouTube if you watched it there. I come out with new content every week there, whether it's in the form of a podcast episode like this, which I actually aim to do one of every week, or some shorter informational video. Also, if you could just leave a comment and suggest some people that you'd like me to interview, or just topics you'd like me to cover, it would be very helpful to know how I can better serve you. And if you listen to it in podcast format, if you could leave a rating on iTunes, it would greatly help out the show, and I would be more than grateful for it. So thanks, guys, for hanging out up until now. Thanks for being here, and see you all next week.